I first got the idea to write Red Sky Morning while watching a documentary on Irish television that told the story of an event that's now called Duffy's Cut in Pennsylvania in 1832, and it told the story of these Irishmen that had left Ireland and to work on a railroad. And 3 months later, all of them were dead, and they were buried in a mass grave that was unmarked, and the story of how they died was covered up. So there was something very strange and disturbing about that. And the story was forgotten. It disappeared into history. It disappeared into the abyss of time. And by an accident, it re-emerged. And two brothers in America began to do an excavation, and suddenly, so the documentary came out of that. And I was very taken with this idea because it was believed that the men were murdered because there was cholera in the camp. Cholera had been spreading across America, and these men were possibly murdered to contain cholera within the valley that they were working in. And I was just very taken with this story because for some, it's one of those times that when you're a writer, you just recognize something that just gives you everything that you possibly need. And I could see in it that I knew these people because I had grown up in North Donegal, and a lot of these men would have come from that area, and so I felt I knew them on a personal basis. I could hear them and see them, and I knew their names, and I recognized that here was something I could really write about. And but there was also the parallel at the time that Ireland was going through a very strange economic period, that Ireland was starting to come apart economically, and I could see that the story of Duffy's Cut somehow represented symbolically something that was happening here about the ideas of how power shapes our lives and how we are really we don't have control over our own lives in the way that we think that we do, and that our lives are shaped by economic forces. And in a way, in the book, there's a factor of that always. So that's where the idea came from. I didn't want to write about this. I tried not to write about this because I'm of the Irish generation that doesn't like these kind of Irish myths about the poor Irish and the Irish, the sentimental Paddy, the sentimental Irishman who's always praying to the Holy Mary, and you know the Brits are terrible. They're terrible to us. It doesn't mean anything to us anymore. I mean, my generation, we had everything. We grew up, we got jobs, it was fine, you know. And so that old history is quite meaningless. But that doesn't mean that, let's say something like Duffy's Cut can't be meaningful now. And so I had to find a way of writing against that idea of Irishness and changing it, to decontaminate it, to make it up to date for my generation. And so when I wrote that book, there's no sentimentality, there's no religion, there's no victim status. People aren't talking about being victims and about blaming people. There's no mention of Britain. There's no Brits in it, really, effectively. Fowler is an Irishman. It's an Irishman chasing an Irishman. And I wanted to find a new way of creating a new myth about emigration today. And because the truth is that in the book, the Irish story is subsumed by the American story, and that is what our lives are like now in Ireland. You know, our American culture is our culture. You know, we don't know what our own culture is anymore, and I'm not saying whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just an interesting thing, and in Red Sky, I think that's a part of it. You know, I don't think you can write anymore the 10,000 word chapter, the long chapters. We can't do that anymore. And when you write fiction now, it has to be in some way. You need to get to the point. It doesn't mean that you can't be free to wander, but everything has to be precise. And so I like the idea of what you can learn from film is that you get into a scene late and you get out early, so that there's no time wasting. And so I kind of learned possibly that kind of technique from watching films. If you want to be a good writer, you have to write about what is truthful to you. You can't pretend to think something about something. You have to write about what you believe in. And to me, it seems that life is very, very hard, and we're very, very lonely most of the time. We are lost. We are ourselves, and we find it very hard to communicate, and it's painful. And and we die, and everybody dies, and everything is lost, and this is a fact, and it might be ugly to say it, but it's true, and so it is the biggest thing to write about. I mean, what else is there to write about? So my imagination is taken to this because I want to understand it more. Even though I can't understand it, I want to try and understand it, and so I write about it. And so maybe it is a kind of philosophical pessimism, you know, but at the same time, while life is all of these things, it's also beautiful. We are surrounded by beauty, and our minds see such amazing things in everything all the time. And that is a fact of life. And so I want to write about everything, you know, and I try to convey with the greatest intensity how beautiful life is, while at the same time how difficult life is. And also beauty is a way of seduction. It's a way of allowing us to look into the void, to stare into the abyss without falling into it. It's a way of comforting us while we look at the hard things. Because if you just wrote the hard things without beauty, you know, even I wouldn't be bothered reading it. It'd be like, oh. What interests me is that I suppose that in the ordinary day-to-day of our lives, we don't tend to really notice the battle that we fight for ourselves. And fiction allows you to take a step back and perhaps look at it from a bigger perspective. I think that, you know, as I was saying, it's a fact of life. You know, it's the only thing worth writing about. Love and death. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's true. You know, I'm not really interested in writing about anything else. But also, the other problem with this is all of this is a rationalization after the fact. That it, you know, if ask me about why I choose to write about something presupposes that I have choice, and I don't believe that I do have choice about what I write about. That novels come to me, and I have to write them. And I often don't want to write them. I didn't want to write Red Sky, and I didn't want to write my second book. I didn't like the idea of my second book is set on an Irish farm, and I didn't want to write another novel on an Irish farm. I was like, I'm not going to do this. And until I realized I had to, because that I wasn't writing about the Irish farm, I was writing against the Irish farm. I was tearing it apart, and tearing apart the ideas associated with it. And so there's always this kind of trouble for me that, you know, the books come to me and I don't necessarily want to write them, but I'm forced to write them. Otherwise, I'm not going to be happy with myself. What I mean is that in the world of publishing, there is a middle ground that perhaps wasn't the middle ground before, but it's the middle ground now of what the most successful writers sound like. And so editors and publishers they buy books that sound like this, and readers want to read books that sound like this. But if you're a young writer, you have to you have to revolt against all that. You have to create your own vision of the world and sound like yourself and bring that. And it's really an admonition against trying to write to sell books, trying to write to be successful, trying to write to be published in a big way. You have to write for yourself, just for yourself, to make that thing inside you happy, which is never happy anyway. I'm never happy about what I write and why I write, but there's something in the process that makes me a little bit happier. And you also have to challenge preconceived ideas. You have to knock against everything and test to see, is it true? Do the things that we believe in as a society, or just as a reader, or, you know, all these, you have to knock against everything and just see what holds up and what doesn't hold up. And so that's what I mean by that. If you write for the center, if you write for the establishment, then you're not trying to test these things. You're trying to uphold them. You're saying this is fine the way it is, but I would never believe that everything is fine the way it is. And so, you know, you have to keep hitting it and seeing what changes.
Okay, Paul.
Perfect. Parfait.